Hi, welcome to the next edition of Beyond the Bubble. And this is a special edition because I'm sitting here with my friend and partner in crime when it comes to AI and workshops, Jacques Foul, who I've known for many years, but we have been working together for about a year at this point. And we've got much closer professionally and became closer friends, I could say. But I have many questions to you, Jacques, some of which I know the answer for. Others I'm curious to hear what that is. So let's get started. And the first question is, how do you describe your path that led you into the studio from the day you were born?
Oh, wow. That's
You got 30 seconds.
that's a tricky question. Good question. I was born in Paris in 89 from two parents that were both French, but my mother's from Cameroon and my father's French. And we lived a couple years outside of Paris, dans l'Oise, in the Oise region in north of Paris. And that's the moment where my mother started applying for jobs, and she got an opportunity to work for the French government as a diplomat. And then we traveled to South Africa, to South Korea.
Okay, you see, that's already a novelty
bunch of
to me.
places.
I didn't know about South
Yes.
Korea a bit.
Yes. And through all these experiences, obviously I studied in different schools, international schools, and I really got interested in everything, like history, economics. And then this led me at some point to live in Brussels to study political science. And after that, I also studied communications because it's also a sort of a sector where you can, have access to psychology, to history, to economics, which I was also really interested in. And yeah, after that, I decided to work in the EU bubble, and here I am today.
Very good. Well, you very generously skipped over a couple of points, which
Yes.
I'm not gonna let you away with. And one of them is you studied in a boarding school, as
Yes.
I
At
understand,
some point,
and
yes.
and not any kind of boarding school, but it was a military boarding school.
Yes,
Is
military
that how you
boarding
would
school.
describe that? Okay,
Yeah,
I'd be
so
curious to hear more about that.
yes, I've always been interested in the military from a very young age because my father was used to be in the Foreign Legion for France. So yeah, it's a long story, but my father was born in 1928, and he went through many different wars as a soldier. And so there's always been these stories that he was sharing when I was a kid of him, on the battlefield. There was always these, really devastating stories sometimes, but also these like fun memories and the pictures he got and the decorations. So yeah, I've always been in this culture of like being interested in the military. And so for high school, I was hesitating between going to a private boarding school, which was military, or just a public school. And I applied and I got accepted, so I decided to go.
At
And
the age of
at the age of 14,
Hmm.
so from 14 to 17. And at first, I really wanted to be in the military, but then a couple months in, I decided that was just too much. And I also understood that a lot of kids my age knew they wanted to be in the military since they were kids, and they trained and they were ready, And I wasn't ready when I saw these kids with, they knew all the exams, they knew all the physical tests, and I was thinking, whoa, there's a big difference. We're not in the same universe, right? And military boarding school taught me a lot about respect, authority, discipline, how to clean my room, all these things. And no, it was a great experience. I was really grateful. And I think it also protected me because when you're a teenager, bullying and protected me from all these things because in a way, the uniform sort of puts everybody on the same level.
Do you have to wear a uniform at school?
Yes.
Military uniform? of sorts?
Not fully military, so we didn't have any, recognizable military, decorations or anything, but very, I don't know, standard, classic, uniform with, your class has a specific color. You have your name tag. So everything was on campus or really close by, so that really made it easy. And since eventually we're trying to study for the baccalaureate, having this environment, this campus environment, really made sure that we were sticking to deadlines and everything was good. So parents also were really happy with that.
Yeah.
Sense of security.
Yeah, no, I totally understand that. It's just for many people that kind of structure is not necessarily a pleasant experience because of the discipline part, or there could be very harsh educators who push it to the edge, or bullying for that matter, because some kids might be, let's say, very adverse or dominant or taking their, so to say, military role too seriously, which is probably some sort of a compensation. But that sort of attitude can very easily happen. But for you, it was a very positive experience, it seems.
Very positive. No, it was really a fun experience, and I got to understand the dynamics of being in the military. No, I think it was really fun, honestly. Great memories.
Huh. And I think it still has a big impact on the way you live your life, in the sense of, and we'll get to that, because you're a very, very calm and very disciplined person as you come across. Now, maybe you might have your own thoughts on that, but I'm just saying, knowing you for some time now, like I said, and I think that sort of attitude and the way you organize your life might be coming from that background. Or maybe your dad, maybe.
I think so. I think obviously it's always your parents a little bit, the environment you live in. But there's a couple things. I think so it's a boarding school, so I had to sleep there. We didn't have much, so we have our clothes, that are really basic. So we really have to use what we have, right? So in a sense, it taught me that you don't need 400 pairs of shoes, you don't need 400 pairs of, whatever accessories, or you don't need 10,000 shirts with 10 different colors. So it kind of taught me minimalism in a way, I just have a set of clothes and I have to deal with it for the week, right? So there's a few lessons that I've got from this school. Obviously, discipline, the sense of authority, understanding hierarchy, just keeping everything clean, everything, calm, good, harmony was also a good thing. The fact that it was also geared towards sports. So the fact that, we have to be friendly amongst each other, we have to respect each other. So all these sort of values were really put in our heads as soon as we got there. So
it's interesting to say that, because it sounds like, based on what you described, that these were very good values for life, not just for school, but ultimately school is meant to prepare you for life. But it seems that they got the right proportion. You'd be a great spokesperson for the school, I believe.
maybe for that school. No, but it's definitely things that you keep, even if you don't realize that they're there and where they come from. You actually keep these values with you, and I think it's only when I start thinking and looking back to all these memories that I understand things that I do just unconsciously these days.
Yeah. So why didn't you stay in the end? Well, stay as in continue that career path.
I didn't stay because I guess I was also curious to see what's outside. Because when you're in that environment for 3 years, you sort of wonder what's on the other side. So then I went to university like everybody else. So I had to, buy clothes and dress like a normal person. So that was interesting. And at first, I was really good in languages, and I decided to do to study English studies. And it was fun, but then I realized, oh, everybody who studies just like me are trying to become English teachers. And I was thinking, I don't want to be an English teacher. So I changed to communications. So that was sort of the next few years of that journey.
Where English served you fairly well, I could say.
I guess a little bit.
Yeah.
Yes, so studied English studies. So there was a lot of literature, just understanding the English language. So the accents, the stressed syllables, and all these things. So it's very, very technical at some point, but I got an understanding of how to improve my English, even though it was decent or pretty good. I was really interested in politics and understanding how the government works, how the state works, how citizens can make decisions, things like that. And so I decided to do a bachelor in political science in Brussels.
And that took about 2 years?
3 years.
3 years, right.
Yeah.
Oh, well, bachelor is 3 years.
Yeah.
Which was another important part of your background, of your studies.
Yes.
Which then led you to another one overseas.
Yeah, so after 3 years, I still felt that my future was in communications. And I had an opportunity to study in Washington, D.C. And so I just applied for different universities in D.C. and I got accepted. So I went to D.C.
As simple as that.
Yes. I mean, it was a lot more complicated.
Yeah, but
Yes.
I'd like to share what you told me recently about how you got advice on improving your resume or CV for the European
Yes.
English speakers, and which is a total different perspective on how these things should be presented for that to be successful with U.S. Admission offices.
Yes, so that was another challenge at this point because obviously I was trying to apply for all these universities and you're in competition. There's people applying from different parts of the world and everybody wants to be in that program, right? So in communications in DC. And my sister at the time, who was already there, who was already studying there, told me, you should talk to this guy. It's a friend of mine. And he will tell you everything about applications and he will even help you with your own application. And so I contacted the guy and I prepared all the documents. So my resume, my cover letter, and I really spent weeks on this cover letter because I really wanted to get accepted, right? And I spent weeks writing it and thinking about my story, thinking about my past, thinking about what I can add to the School of Communication, thinking about, what makes me a good candidate, really going through everything. It was kind of like a therapy session with myself, right? Just writing and understanding who I am, who I want to be. And so I come up with this final cover letter. I was really proud because everything was in there, all these stories about my past. And so I send it to this person and I wait a couple days. I have no answer. And I'm thinking, well, maybe he's busy. I don't know what's going on. So I was kind of stressed. And I finally get an answer. And he is pretty blunt and he tells me there's a few things to modify. Here's the track changes. So here's the document. Let me know what you think. And so I opened the document and basically everything was in red. So everything was to be corrected. And I was thinking, what's wrong? So I have conversations with him and he's explaining me a little bit how to apply, how to be better at doing applications. And that's the first time I understand how, I'm not sure if it's Americans, but how to improve your application, to how to improve the way you present yourself, how to improve
Sales pitch.
Your sales pitch, your storytelling, how to improve all these things. And these are the things that I've never learned before because in France, I've never learned how to put something together like this, and it was very difficult. And he gave me some tips. And one of the tips was to make my cover letter stand out. And when he said, I'm going to help you do that, I was just thinking, sure, but my cover letter is perfect. I don't know how you can improve that. I said how I'm different. I told my story. There's nothing more I can do to make myself more interesting to these universities. And he told me just a simple thing. He told me, listen, I want you to do some research on the professors who are going to be in that program, who are going to potentially, give these lessons, right? So I Googled all these professors. I had the email addresses, and I reached out to them asking a simple question about their specific class.
So this is just to say, you are not accepted by any means. On the contrary, you are just applying for the program.
Yep.
But your sister's friend is advising you to proactively reach out to the professors who would be teaching you if you were accepted in advance, even before anything, you have any relation with the school, just to ask them a couple of questions.
Yes.
This is so far away from any European person's
I guess so.
approach or idea. I would never think about such an approach.
Yes, because it's very intrusive.
Maybe not intrusive. It's just like, why would I contact a person who's a total alien to me? And I'm an alien to them because I don't have any relation with the school as such.
Well, that's what I thought at the time. I didn't really see the purpose or how I was going to gain something from it. And so he basically told me what to do. And so I sent the questions, and a number of professors answered. And these professors...
Well, I'll pause you here for a second.
Yes.
So first of all, a complete stranger emails them in this complete stranger because the only thing that connects you to them is you're interested in the school. And the number of them actually answered.
So yes, so I asked questions like, what is your course going to be about? Is it going to be about, U.S. politics, or is it going to be about EU politics? So very basic, simple questions that someone in my position would be interested in having answers. And some of the professors answered, and they confirmed some of the information that I had, or they said, no, actually, it's not this, it's this other information. And I basically used those answers in my cover letter, saying I'm really interested in this program because, for example, the class about U.S. media really is interesting because it has this component. And by the way, I checked with Professor X, Y, and Z, who confirmed that information. And so by doing this simple trick, showing that I've done the work and I've done something a little bit beyond what the typical applicant might do, it shows that I'm motivated, that I actually am interested in the program, and that, I can distinguish myself or make myself a little bit more special.
That you're proactive.
Eyes. Yes, exactly.
Amazing. Was there any other trick or that you recall, or you build that in?
Any other trick? I think it's in the intentions and also the wording of these stories. So obviously coming from a French background, we tend to write long sentences and convoluted sentences. So, and when you write in English, you have to be sharper and a lot more to the point. So that was another adjustment I had to make. And I think maybe in the French system, we are taught to be a little bit more modest in applications. We're not taught to think that we're the best candidate. We're taught to be like, this is my story. If you like it, let's do something, and that's it. But from an American point of view, no, I'm the right person for this job.
There's no doubt about it.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I gotta say it, and you gotta believe me.
Yes, and this kind of led me also in a funny way to help my friends to apply for jobs when I came back from the US.
So you advised them about applying for jobs in Brussels?
Applying for jobs wherever.
Or wherever.
I helped a friend of mine apply for jobs in Madrid, for example, and I helped her with, resumes and cover letters and interviews and sort of having the mindset to actually fight for what she wants. So, yeah.
Great. So apparently this worked out for you because you sent in your application and you got accepted.
I got accepted, yes.
And which university was that?
That was American University in DC. And it was also a great experience. I also adjusted my English skills once more, and that's where I got the accent.
The non-existent accent.
Yes,
Meaning,
I mean,
yeah, no, you got a beautiful, beautiful, almost native accent, or fully native accent. Who am I to say? But which, with all respect to the French. Born English speakers is not so common, and I'm talking about others who take English as a second language, which for you seems, like I said, to be a full American native level.
Thank you.
So how did you get that to that level? Was that the U.S. experience, or was it already before?
So my first school was an English school, English speaking school in South Africa. So I think that's where I picked up the English skills. And in the US, I think it's just being in contact with people in general. So I was part of a soccer team, football team, depending on which side of the pond you are. So being in contact with people, having friends there. Also, the slang is really important, more than whatever you learn in school. So sometimes in school you can have a really good level, but when you're thrown on the street and you have to solve a problem, at the supermarket, then it's a completely different way of speaking, right? So it's learning all these nuances, and also just accepting that maybe I need to get this American accent because it's another way of being fluent and understanding the nuances of the language. Because I think I had before that a French/British/ maybe South African accent, and it was maybe confusing to some people. So just switching to a full American accent is just easier, I guess.
Was it part of you, say, culturally trying to fit in more, or was it purely a linguistic effort?
I think it was just easier, I think, to just morph my accent into whatever was in the environment, basically. And so by the time I left the US, I had a lot of people telling me, so which state are you from? And that was sort of a confirmation that I've done a
You
good
got
job.
it. You
Yes.
reached
Yes.
the pinnacle of linguistic proficiency. Yeah.
I tried.
Very nice. So, but let me just go back for 1 second to this cultural aspect. I'm pretty interested because, let's say, there have been many French thinkers and intellectuals who have very strong views on the U.S. and deep thinking about it, often very critical and sometimes admiring, and sometimes it's both. That is to say that it's not only that the French have given the Statue of Liberty to the U.S., but there are a lot of ideas that entered the American political system and the American culture. At the same time, these are vastly different ways of looking at the world. So what are your thoughts on that? Is there something that you can recall that struck you as radically different way of looking at something or tackling a certain issue on in an everyday situation?
I think there's a few differences that I've seen in the US compared to France. Just in the relationship between people, it's a lot easier to build connections with people in the US versus France. So, when you meet someone in real life, it's just easier in the US. Some people say that it's maybe more shallow. But I don't know. I did not have this experience. I felt that everybody was very friendly and approachable. So I really felt like I could easily live there and have a good time. I think sometimes in France, it's just very, well, at least in Paris, let's say, it's sometimes seen as a place where people are a little bit more distant, or if you're not a part of a specific circle, then it's difficult to step in and build connections. But apart from that, I mean, yes, I do think that there's differences, but that's where the beauty of traveling is, right? Is to understand the differences and also just understand that you're not in your country and that you have to take everything that is around you and make the most of it.
Something comes to mind where I do sense that often many Europeans, when they go to the US, and I include myself as the kind of European who's been to the US a number of times and worked with American organizations a lot, there is a bit of sense of maybe I'd say intellectual superiority. And again, I'm not saying I feel that way, but I do sense from many people I know who have a great admiration for the U.S. and this awe kind of feeling of the sheer power of the country in a broader sense, political, military, the size of the buildings, the size of the portions in the restaurant, like the whole place has a great, what is the word, carries a lot of energy with it. And at the same time, many Europeans say, well, still, we tend to know more about the world. We are more informed about history or culture or those kind of things which have happened on our continent 2,000 years ago. So there is this intellectual attitude, which I don't think there's a bit of arrogance in there. How do you see this?
I think it's definitely arrogance because who are we to say that we're, more intellectual culture or we've understood things differently or, we're more advanced in the way of thinking. I think there's a lot of things to learn from the US and there's a lot of things to learn from Europe. I just think I think Europe is called the old continent for a reason because, everything started there. Even the US, has obviously some inspiration and a lot of people immigrated from Europe to the US. So there's a lot of things. It seems like a lot of people see Europe as like the basis of, culture and art and history and things like that. But I think there's a lot of things to learn from many different cultures. And having a mother who, started living in Cameroon and a father from France and, his mother was from Normandy and his father was from the south of France and our great-grandparents are from Algeria. So it's a complete mix, right? And I think that's what the world is too, right? It's a complete mix. So it's how we can live together and learn from each other and learn from all these different cultures. So yeah, I think it's interesting to see these differences because that's where the gold is, I think.
One specific area that you and I had talked about earlier is about the whole idea about competitiveness or competition rather. Take a business, you're a consultant, you're applying for a project, and how you approach that entire process of how competitive are you, how you structure a business, and how you want to raise money, and just the drive that's in it. And the US is famous for that. So that sort of attitude is often in great contrast with many European countries, and the one we're sitting in right now is often heavily criticized for that, where maybe the rhythm of life is very different and the values or the priorities in life are vastly, vastly different. And I can very easily argue for both to say this one is better, that one is better, or how you put together. But I think fundamentally it comes down to the proportions. Which one do you prioritize, and not to have too little or too much of either? Because if you say, well, it's only about the good quality of life and enjoying work-life balance, even towards the life part of going out or hanging out with friends or free time. But then at the same time, you do want to drive business as a service provider, but also as a consumer, you want to have better quality services, which ultimately come from competition. So how do you relate to that?
Well, I think we as humans are multidimensional. And so we all learn from different cultures and different experiences. And I think competition is a big thing in the US. And it's also what helped me build my career because I've learned how to motivate myself, how to present myself in a different way, how to avoid being too modest when I'm, doing things, when I'm working with clients. So it's learning different ways of life and what really works for you, right? So being from, with my French background, there's a lot of things that I've learned really young about what it is to be French and proud to be French and all these things. But there's then a lot of things I've learned from, studying or being in school in South Africa, when the apartheid was just ending, or being in South Korea with a completely different culture where, different values were, projected. So it's how can we use all these different elements from all these different countries to create maybe a personality or create like a sensitivity to these things. And I'm really grateful for having all these experiences.
And you mentioned South Africa and at the end of apartheid. That sounds
Yep.
very, well, interesting and sounds probably very, very challenging period. So how was that time for you?
Well, that time was super enjoyable for me because as a child, you have a dog, you have a pool. It's always sunny, so you don't really think about these things. I was 5, so for me it was all sunshine and rainbows. But I think it was maybe harder for my parents because security was a big issue. My father's white, my mother's black. At the time, having that set up doesn't make things easy. My mother always talks about these stories of her trying to buy a television or opening a bank account and people telling her, well, you can't really do that. We need your husband's signature for these things. Or I remember there was a story where we went to the restaurant and we were all sitting at the table. We had a nice meal, and then the situation with the bill arrives. And so one of the waiters goes to my father, obviously, older gentleman, white. Let's give him the bill. Just makes sense, right? So my father gets the bill. And just as a way of teasing them, he turns to my mother and gives the bill to my mother. And there was sort of everybody was kind of in shock in the side of the waiters because they were thinking, what is this deal? Like, here's this older white man giving the bill to this black woman. What's happening with that? And I think that's something that always happened in my family, like sort of the contradictions, like always using these contradictions, right? We do things differently in Africa. We do things differently in France. So how can we not necessarily tease or provoke people, but how can we play around these rules or these sort of guidelines that people impose on us? And I've always been raised with the idea that we shouldn't necessarily always follow these guidelines or these stereotypes. We should go beyond those because it's fun, but also because there's something greater than that, right? Than stereotypes and negativity. There's more to learn from each other than to follow these arbitrary rules that make no sense.
Have you always been so open to that sort of approach, or this is something that has come with time? Because I can very easily imagine the little Jacques not looking at the world in such an understanding and wise manner, but maybe fighting against it or rebelling against it or just being frustrated for certain injustices at large.
Mm.
But then perhaps you came to a point when you said, okay, I need to change my attitude. Or maybe that was from the beginning.
I think just being exposed to different cultures and so my parents always wanted me to have a connection with Cameroon, my mother's country. And going there as a child also taught me that, your comfort, your European comfort is nice, but this is how people live here. So have a look around and see how grateful you should be about what's going on in Europe. So I think from a very young age, I was exposed to that. And so it taught me that um, I need to be grateful for what I have, and that I should not complain or go to the complaining side so easily, because some people have it worse. So it's ingrained in me. I have to deal with it, and having my own family in situations, potentially a situation of poverty, teaches you a lot.
I'm fascinated by this and also inspired because I do see many people who would get very angry seeing that kind of situation and look at the sentiment in them that would grow would be the feeling of injustice, the feeling of anger, the feeling of a deep frustration to say, look at the situation we're finding ourselves in because of the government, because of colonial past, because of so many reasons. And yet I see none of that in you. So that's interesting where you look at it with far more understanding is perhaps the word, or maybe the wisdom of it. I appreciate it a lot. So where do you think that's from, or is that a proper way of describing this?
Well, I think the wisdom comes from the situations I've had in Africa with my family, because they're not, how can I put this? They don't see their situation in the same light. They're not rebelling, or they're not feeling left behind or something. They have a different perspective on life, right? For example, when I was a child, sometimes someone would pass away and they would throw a big party, right? So they have completely different views over death or poverty, or just having a lack of something, right? And so that also taught me that, maybe there's always a bright side in the end in life, right? So when someone would pass away in Cameroon, they would have a feast for a week, and people would dance, people would cry, people would be together. And at first I was thinking, this is wrong, right? Because the natural way of doing things is when someone dies, we have to go to church. We have to go to church. We have to be together. We have to cry. We have to, wear black. And there it's completely different. So it's a humbling experience where we understand that, there's brighter things than just thinking about the worst.
It's a very, let's say, pragmatic or very human way of looking at the way the world is. And I do genuinely wonder how it comes together. I don't have the answer immediately. I'm just kind of thinking out loud. But how does it come together of not resigning yourself to whatever state the world is in, but having an ambition, be that professionally or be that, say, politically, to say, hey, I do want things to change, and I do want to change things in my life or get to a better financial or personal circumstances, or I see so many wrongs in the world that I want to change it. So it can lead to an apathy, or it can be, you can be the most vocal activist out there. So where is that balance?
I mean, sure. I could be very feeling that everything needs to change and the world needs to change, and that's also what I think, right? I think that I'm an idealist in a way, because I see things from a philosophical point of view. I see things from, what's going to happen in the future. And sometimes I found myself in situations where I wasn't really always understood for having this sort of opinion, right? So what I'm seeing from, our culture, from the news, from what's happening every day, is that we live in a world that's very polarized, and it's almost not taking a position is taking a position, and taking a position is going against another position. And I don't always want to be, for example, in my LinkedIn content, political, because I do feel that a specific position could be interesting, but also the other side is also interesting. Like, I think I kind of want to look at things from an objective point of view and see how we can navigate these issues on both sides, right? And that's why I think it was really interesting. It is really interesting to work in public affairs because we're constantly in front of all these different positions, and it's how we navigate these things. But that's, I don't know if it answers your question, but I do take positions on a lot of things, but I also just like to contemplate what's happening around me. So learn, read, ask people questions because I'm really curious. And it takes me a while to take a firm position on something because I really want to have both angles before making a decision. And when it comes to my background, when it comes to Africa, yes, there's a lot of things to say about it. A lot of things to say about how governments are being, how can I put this, formed, or how France still has an impact on the lives of a lot of people in West Africa. You know, there's a lot of things. There's conflicts. But I think whenever I think about these things, I always think about my family there and how they think, how they view things. And I feel content. I feel like everything is at its place in a way, even though it's not fully, because I could really be angry about a lot of things. But their perspective is so positive that it sort of calms me down.
Hmm. No, and one thing I do want to come back to, what I'm sensing between the lines, and to some degree we had talked about it, not necessarily in this specific form, is the whole notion of victimhood and the whole notion of if something has historically been committed to a group of people or to certain countries or parts of the world, and I sense zero of that in you, and I think maybe, I mean, the armchair psychologist in me says it's maybe the military school and your parents' overall attitude towards life, where you would never look at yourself as really exposed to these forces in the world. So you have a lot of agency as an individual to shape your own path.
No, exactly. I've never been raised with the idea that I'm a black man or a mixed man, and you know, it's going to be so much harder for me to become someone or to do something that I want to do. Obviously, I've been told that it might be harder because, you know, for example, it's always this, when you're mixed, it's always the difficulty of identifying. So in France, you're seen as a foreigner, and then when you're in Africa, you're seen also as a foreigner, right? So you can't really fully connect, I would say, although I feel connected in both ways. And I think it's some sort of a power that I have to be in between these two cultures. So I'm really grateful for that. And so I've never been raised with the idea that I'm a victim. And even when people are disrespectful, I would just think that they're clumsy. So that was my sort of protection. But seeing things that are really worse in my life and people really struggling. So when I was in South Africa, seeing, you know, on the same street, you would have villas on one side and townships on the other, and seeing really people struggle made me really grateful about what I have. And I'm by no means a victim of anything. I think it's sometimes we have self-imposed limitations and beliefs that we feel comfortable in because we then identify as being a victim, and, you know, people are against us and we're locked in a situation. But I don't find myself locked in any situation.
I think that look on life and that sort of attitude is probably the most powerful one. Because just in the previous episode, I had spoken with a good friend of mine who was literally a victim of terrorism, and today she doesn't look at herself in that way, and that's great, because that's exactly the kind of stories we tell ourselves, and the way we see our place in the world has a massive impact on our general well-being, but also the general way we comport ourselves in any situation.
Yeah, I think it's for me, I always try to look beyond that. So let's imagine I'm a victim. How is that going to help me in any way? Like if I'm trying to, raise children, if I'm trying to build a company, if I'm trying to, meet people, connect with them, how is that mentality going to help me?
I think the ultimate opposite of victimhood is taking responsibility for yourself. And again, not discounting for a single second that somebody who's genuinely a victim or is heavily impacted by legacy or history or anything else. And yet, not denying that background or not denying that history, but that this very deep understanding that I take responsibility for myself, because that gives you a lot of power.
Yeah, so what I'm trying to say is not obviously there are people who have suffered abuse and very negative things in life, and I'm not trying to say that by no means they should, identify or they should, feel a certain way about their situation. Obviously, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that there's something beyond just victimhood. There's more to life than just feeling that people are against you. And yeah, so I think a lot of people assume, and it's really funny. I had a conversation recently with someone that I've randomly met, and the person told me, well, as a black man, don't you think that, your position in society is, altered, or do you think you have fewer rights, or your people disrespect you more, or things like that? And I said, no, I don't find myself different or not worthy or things like that. I just do my own thing, and if people don't like it, then it's fine.
Was the person surprised by that answer?
Yes, because they assumed I would be supportive of the Black Lives Matter movement, that I would be enraged by how people treat black people or people from African descent. But I'm not fully. I understand the dynamics. I understand where the pain comes from. I understand the debates, but I don't put myself in that situation. I'm not suffering from that. I think there's a difference between pain and suffering, because we all feel pain. We all feel a certain amount of pain when something negative happens, but suffering is a different thing. Suffering is something that we impose on ourselves.
And especially if it's beyond the physical part, which is the pain part, and let's say that you have much less choice over that. But when it comes to broader issues, societal issues, or narratives for that matter, it has a massive impact on how you perceive the situation and how you see your own place in that.
No, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's your environment. Your environment sort of affects your way of thinking. Your way of thinking affects your environment. So everything is intertwined, right? So I've never been taught or raised to think that way, because that would necessarily lead me to think that way. I think my father, when he married my mother, he always told her that she could be whatever she wants to be. And that led her to apply for specific jobs and to push and to, reach out to people and to fight for what she wants. And then when she got what she wanted, that sort of confirmed what he was saying. And then
Reinforced
the narrative. And so by reinforcing the narrative, then you reinforce the narrative for your children too, and then they reinforce, and then it's a snowball effect. So it's only by pushing and by standing for what you believe in, that you sort of reinforce the dynamic.
And you're a very self-reflective person, and we can talk a little bit about our joint work together, which is on AI and the workshops we run. But again, I think one of the reasons why it's so interesting, the many conversations we have around that, is because a lot has to do with self-reflection. And we're not talking specifically about the software or whatever AI is akin to a human, but it ultimately comes down to you thinking about yourself as the user of it so that you can ask better questions. And that leads me to your favorite topic, which we often discuss, which is asking deeper questions. So how do you relate to that about your own introspection or your own way of asking deeper questions from yourself? And if you feel like sharing what you ask ChatGPT to help you with that introspection might be fun.
Sure. I think like most people who sometimes go through therapy, they are looking for answers. They're looking for new ways of thinking, and they're looking for help. And if I go back to the COVID phase, for example, I went to see a therapist, or at least we communicated online. That was a different way of doing things. And if I look back, what I really learned from that experience was that it's not necessarily the answers we're looking for, it's the questions we're looking for. Or at least the questions will spark something more than the answers will, right? And so I remember this therapist used to tell me, I would explain what was going on during the week. And I was saying, I really feel angry about this thing, and it's really blowing up my week. It's really changing the way I see things. It's really bad, and I'm really angry. And this is a really negative situation for me. And he would listen, and then he would say, you're saying that this is a negative situation, but what gives you that impression? So that question made me realize maybe what I'm seeing is just an impression. Maybe the situation is objectively okay, but my impression of it is negative. And maybe if I change my impression or the way I see things, then the things I see will change, right? So then this led me a few years later, when AI sort of, revolutionized everything and came into play, I started asking questions, started saying, how can I improve myself? How could I do this? How could I change the way I think about this thing? This is my view on this. What are the counter arguments to help me better understand the whole topic, right? And I saw some people floating some ideas online. And there was this idea of asking, based on everything you know about me, tell me in vivid detail what your future might look like.
My future. Yes. I mean, your own.
Yes, my own future. And so AI has this capacity of memorizing things. So it memorizes what you're typing, what you're interested in, where you work, what your sensitivity is. And so by asking the question based on everything you know about me, you're going back into this memory, and it sort of gives you some ideas of things that you could be doing, right? So what your future might look like based on what you're working on at the moment. And that's where, it suggested that I work to get a Nobel Peace Prize, which was really funny.
Go!
That's a nice goal to have. And some goals were even smaller, like just writing a book or maybe opening an institute for AI in communications, And these ideas sound like really maybe too big to be true, or they seem maybe too generic, but it's a conversation starter. It just gets you to think about these things, right? It's kind of like saying, okay, you're going to get the Nobel Peace Prize. Then you start thinking, wait, so how do we get the Nobel Peace Prize? Is that actually possible? Could I actually do it? And that's sort of the things
you got a couple of decades ahead of you, so.
Yes, but then you start thinking, well, actually, I can ask a question, a follow-up question saying, okay, if I were to go for the Nobel Peace Prize in the next 30 years, what is the best way to do it? And then you would start having answers. And with these answers, you would follow up and say, okay, so if I'm really taking this seriously, what would my daily habits look like? Or what should I be aiming for every year? Or who should I talk to get closer to this goal, right? And I think that's what AI is enabling. It's enabling us to think beyond what we think is possible. Even if it sounds crazy or impossible, we can actually just brainstorm, think about it, and see if it's something we want to do.
You know, an interesting thing here is that the question that can so much open your mental paradigm might be actually coming from you. And the AI kind of fills in the gaps towards the road that leads there. But what you're also saying that with a good therapist, and I think that's the number one role of any good therapist, is to ask deeper questions.
Mm-hmm.
So to expand your mental paradigm or just the way you see things. Like that question when you say, okay, you had some whatever stuff that upset you in that week. Yeah, but that's just a frame you put on it because you look at it through your own filter, because the facts on the ground are neutral. They are just what it is. You say, well, it's raining today and I was going to go jogging. It's horrible. Well, maybe not horrible. It's just raining. That's
Exactly.
it.
Yeah.
There's no value judgment in it. So what I'm saying is, just to bring that together with the importance of a good question to reframe your paradigm, but with AI, you can do both. So you can even prompt that to say, well, ask me a question that would totally shift the way I see things.
No, exactly. There's another question I've been playing with because in our space in communications, I feel like everybody feels busy, right? Everybody has emails, answering requests, writing content, and it's getting really tricky to find some time for ourselves, right? And there's this question I sometimes ask is, if you're feeling busy on a weekly basis, imagine you only had 4 hours to work this week. What would you focus on? And that usually opens doors to, okay, if I only had 4 hours, then I can't be scrolling stuff on social media. I can't be just spending all my days on emails. I would probably try to build connections with my partners. I would probably try to organize my events that I've been, postponing for weeks. And I would probably try to reconnect with, my team. And that usually gives you some ideas, right? So I think as communicators, I think we need to ask deeper questions because AI is going to change the way we work. It's going to change the amount of content that is being produced. It's going to change the way we hire, the way we collaborate. So we just have to ask deeper questions. We're just going to be forced to be in a world where it's not just about coming up with fast answers. It's about asking deeper questions.
I want to come back to somewhat, very related, but a different angle on this, which is, I think asking deeper questions is the first step, perhaps the most important one, but still the first step. And what I sometimes found myself in the past is I would be confronted with a deep question, with a really difficult question, which might be a super simple question, but in substance a difficult one, and I would just run away from it. I would say, I don't have now the time to really think it through, to really answer it. Let's just move on. So I think that the next bit of this is where the discipline comes back, where you say, okay, here's a deep question, but let me take the time to truly reflect on it. When you say, okay, my question to myself is, where do I want to be in 10 years? What if my wildest dreams came true, or what those wildest dreams are to come true in the next 10 years? Well, there's no quick answer for that if you really want to answer it properly.
No, exactly. I think it's a test and learn situation where you ask questions, you answer, you find deeper questions. I think a question that we recently asked in a workshop was, if I were to triple X or 10X my impact, what should I be focusing on, right? And so by asking these questions, we will get answers from AI systems and from people and from brainstorming as a team. But we have to go further, right? Ask even deeper questions, or just continue asking questions until we get to a final answer. And I think when we were kids, we would ask 10,000 questions a day. Why is this happening? Why is this going down? Why is this going up? Why are people walking on sidewalks? Or why are cars driving this way? You know? And I think we lost this ability to ask questions because of society, because we don't want to look foolish in school, asking questions or not understanding concepts. So I think it's a matter of time that we learn how to ask questions. And there was also a gentleman recently that asked a question in our webinar or workshop, and he asked, what do you think is going to be the future of education now that AI is in the mix, right? And it got me thinking, is the role of education to train kids on how to memorize answers, which I think it is right now, or it is to train them to ask questions or better questions, right? And I don't know on which side you are personally, but I'm more on the question side, because that's going to be the future generation, and it's only by asking deeper questions that you get better answers.
Yeah, I don't think it's an either or question. It's not an either or thing. I'm very much with you on asking deeper questions, but a fundamental prerequisite of asking deeper questions is that you need to know stuff in order to be able to ask questions. Because if let's say I give you actually a personal example where many years ago, over 2 decades ago, I got to participate at a very high level gala dinner, which was for some high achievers. And not that I was a high achiever at the time. I don't know if I am now, but at the time, definitely not. But still, it was organized in Budapest, and we got an invitation with a couple of friends. Bottom line is, so we found ourselves at a table at a high-level dinner with Nobel Prize winners. So I'm sitting there, and this dude next to me, he's a Nobel Prize winner. I have no idea who it was actually at the time, but someone extremely with a high level of achievement. And I'm sitting there, and I just have no idea what to ask, right? Because I know nothing about his topic of expertise. Maybe it was physics, maybe it was something else. But I was so ignorant, certainly about the subject, but even ignorant about the methodology of asking a good question, for what is a good question, that I was sitting next to him, and I just really couldn't use that once in a lifetime opportunity to meet someone of that standard. So that's the story that comes to mind. As to be able to ask deeper questions, you need to have a certain level of knowledge to do that.
No, I agree. I think it's maybe less of a distinction between both, but I think when I was thinking about that, I was thinking at the educational system where we're forcing kids to memorize things, even though there's no context. Sometimes it doesn't really make sense. Sometimes the topics are a bit off. There's a lot of things that I've learned in school that I never use now or don't find that interesting, for example. So I agree. I think it's maybe a mix of both rather than a contradiction or an opposition. But something that I remember from when I was studying was that I wish I actually asked more questions.
I'll just jump in for 1 second to say, for you to ask better questions, you need to be convinced that you have the right to ask those questions. You're not going to be made feel silly that you're asking even a silly question. Right? You need to have that inner conviction that asking questions no matter what, and sometimes even challenging the status quo kind of question. When you say, okay, why are cars in Europe or in most parts of Europe are driving on the left, on the right, whereas in some other countries it's on the left? Why? Is there a benefit to it? Okay, yeah, it's not a big challenge of the status quo, but were you to implement it, would lead to some disruptions. But you need to have the inner conviction that asking any kind of question is legit.
Yes, I think when you're growing up, it's sometimes difficult to ask questions in class because there's a lot of people around you, and you don't want to look silly. So that's maybe something that prevented me from asking more questions. I think you're right. Um, but I wish, for example, we had philosophy classes relatively young, right? Not extremely complicated, but I don't know, maybe if I was 6 or 7, maybe having just a teacher ask me, so what do you think is beauty? Why do you think this is beautiful? What makes this beautiful? Very simple questions at that age, just to make you think about, how you're thinking actually, you know? I think that would have been really interesting because I loved my philosophy classes in high school, but I loved them so much that I thought that it would have been so much better to have them earlier in my education. So
That's a very, very good point.
mhm.
I remember my philosophy classes, I think it was in high school, and that wasn't great because I think it was more focused on who said what instead
Ah,
of taking a concept or an idea, and whether it was Plato or it was Schopenhauer or whoever, that's kind of secondary. But to say a core, basic, deep question like that, I think it can trigger a full hour of debate in class.
yes, and I think everybody has an opinion on it, and also the professor then is more of a facilitator rather than a teacher, or rather than presenter or someone with authority. He would just navigate the conversation between people and oppose thoughts and bring some ideas to the conversation. So yeah, I think that would have been really interesting. And philosophy is so pervasive. It goes in every part of society that, it's really interesting field,
It's
definitely.
very meta,
It's very meta. It's a meta field.
right? And then that brings me to the topic of the meta questions.
Meta questions, yeah.
Yes, yes. So there is this whole idea of
Mhm.
the meta question, where you ask a question to get a better question. How do you use that?
Well, I use it with AI tools because sometimes I run out of ideas for questions,
Oh,
and
it
so
happens.
it happens. Yeah, it does more than I want to. But basically, you're asking AI to ask a question. So when you don't know what questions to ask, you can just talk about a challenge you're facing at work, and then you say, "What would be an interesting question about, the situation?" Or can you write a prompt to help me, get an answer or to help me solve this problem, for example. And so, yes, I think AI it's such a great tool for brainstorming, coming up with ideas, coming up with questions, so we can just like go deeper in our work. And I think a lot of people were kind of amazed when we used that technique in our workshops. So,
Why do you think they were amazed by that?
well, I think it's because when people use Google or AI tools, they just want the tool to do something. So just create this post or create this article or write this, briefing document or do this, do that. And it's just very, it's focusing on execution. We're forcing these systems to do something, but we're not really thinking about strategy. We're not thinking about questions. We're not thinking about, are we actually focusing on the right things? So that's where I think asking a question or just being humble with the situation and saying, I don't have all the answers. I don't know the question. I don't know how to tackle this problem. Just being humble with the situation just makes everything easier, I think.
My hunch is that it's because we're not used to the whole idea that I can ask a question from a machine. Not so much. Certainly, you can ask Google. Well, I want to find out what's the population of Zimbabwe. Great, but in the sense of very open-ended questions. So these don't necessarily have a predetermined answer, and it's not even that. Even if you Google, say, "Give me birthday ideas," well, you can find any number of websites with birthday party ideas. But the kind of question that you can ask from these systems is like very open-ended, and it's very proactive. But even more so, I think you said the key word there, that you need to be humble with this. And then comes I think it's a quote from some movie. Yes, it's actually from the movie A Few Good Men.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I think Jack Nicholson says, "You can't handle the truth," and it's not about the truth with capital T, but are you ready to hear new ideas? Are you ready to hear those new inputs, or being challenged from where you are? So the humility, or say lack of ego, is a fundamental part of that. And again, it's not just AI. We're really talking more philosophically than purely AI. And I think, again, going back to your way of living, way of seeing the world, that's something I do appreciate. Just the whole idea of, are you ready to hear even those challenging questions that might shift your paradigm, or some factoid that might put things in a very different perspective. So it's, what I'm saying is, the kind of losing the ego, or not having an ego to the degree that you can, so you are able to take in those new perspectives. And I think you personally live by that. And again, having the open mind, but not necessarily to the degree that your values fall out of your brain when the mind is just so open. So there is the fil rouge, the red thread, that is essentially core values that have that determine the way you live your life and see the world, and at the same time being open-minded.
Yeah, it's a difficult exercise, because you have to understand different points of view. You have to be empathetic. You have to be compassionate. You have to understand that people come from different places. And I think even when we use these AI tools, we sometimes ask them to criticize our work, which is very difficult sometimes, because we put a lot of effort into something, and then this machine just says, this is wrong, this has flaws, has inconsistencies, right? So it's just understanding that nothing is perfect, nothing is judgmental. There's nothing really that negative in that space when you're humble and when you're trying to learn new things. So just keeping that in mind can help just improve the way we think, so we can just have a better life, I think.
Yeah, I think at the same time it's important to say, but there are better ways of doing certain things.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not this absolute nihilism to say, well, there's nothing, perfection obviously doesn't exist, but even striving for something better, or qualitatively better, or more aligned with our values is not even worth it. Of course it's worth it. Of course there's a better way of writing a resume.
Mm-hmm.
Even if your version was perfect, but there came someone who gave you such a totally out of the box perspective that it got so much better that it landed you a place at the university.
Yes, I think it's we just have to be humble with our work, with who we are, and understand that we're constantly learning. That's the human experience. We're learning new things, and I think in this world where everything is polarized, I think if we just open a little bit more and try to understand the other side, then that could solve a lot of problems.
I want to bring in, just as a final concept or final idea here, the word boundaries. Because when you say, okay, you need to be extremely open-minded and explore different ways, but again, it's not endless, not boundless. There are certain limitations where you say, okay, well, I understand someone can have a radically different perspective on how I work, or the way you organize urban waste management, to take a very mundane and down to earth example. You say, okay, I understand those different ways of organizing things, but yeah, there's a limit. But even there's a limit of certain ideas, because the world is full of ideas, but there are a lot of bad ideas out there, from economic systems to many other political or other ideas. So how do you reconcile the open-mindedness with drawing a line somewhere?
Well, I think I'm just curious, a little bit like researchers that focus on things that are not necessarily their cup of tea, or things that are, completely foreign to what their life is about, for example, right? So obviously there's boundaries, and that's where the values comes in. Like, you don't want to be, promoting something completely different from what you believe in. But at the same time, we have to keep an open mind, because if you're supporting a specific position, it's because you're against another position. But what is that other position, right? It's only by knowing what you're against that you form a position. So it's interesting because a lot of people just set their mind on something, and social media reinforces that with filter bubbles and the fact that we're served a specific type of content that reaffirms a little bit what we believe in. And I think we should go the other way and see what others are doing. There's an app called Ground News, and it helps people sort of understand how a news story is being told in Fox News and different media outlets. And I think these kind of apps or tools can help us see all the different perspective of one single story, right? And I think that's where the magic of AI and communications and political science and everything comes back together, because then we can understand different perspective, where they come from, and eventually how we're just all different and have different viewpoints on things. And I think in the end, I think the world is rich because of these viewpoints. It's rich because we're all different and we look different and we think differently, right? And so it's all about learning from each other and just going forward.
And I mean, just to go back to this point as a final bit, so you travel quite a lot, and often you spend extended periods of time in different places because of the nature of your work, and you can do that remotely. And still, there are quite a few places where you say, "Well, I'm just not comfortable here," or "This doesn't resonate with my sense of orderliness," or the food is just not my kind of thing. So again, that's what I'm saying is that there is that diversity of places and environments in which you could go, but you do have those limitations and say, okay, what does resonate with me? What do I think that for me personally that works better?
Well, I think after studying and living in different places, I got to understand what I'm sensitive to. And I think for me, what's really important is the notion of peace. So knowing that around me, I can relax, I can feel calm, I have space. So I think peace is something that's really important to me. And again, connection, being confronted with different points of views. This is also what makes everything more richer, more interesting, right? So whenever I travel, I try to keep that in mind. So finding a place where I can have my peace, and as an introvert, that's why that is. But also a place where I can connect with people, because I love learning from different experiences.
One word that came to my mind, and this is where we'll close our conversation, which I think we could go on for a long time, and maybe there will be another occasion for that. But one word that comes to my mind, even more than peace, is harmony. And harmony is ultimately about balance, but not balance as in equal measure between two things, but an equilibrium between multiple things. Because you mentioned that, it's how much social life you want to have, how much orderliness you want to have around you versus the chaos of a shuk, of a Middle Eastern market, or being in the desert where it's the ultimate peace, right? And
Yes.
and also having a part in it where your intellectual self is balanced, again, together with the physical self, with the food and all the rest.
No, I think that's important. I think it's important to see where we feel comfortable and also understand why we feel comfortable in those spaces, right? So I think there was an interview a couple of years back with Pharrell Williams, and he said that...
The singer.
Yes. And he said something about what becomes his favorite song. You know, when you hear a song for the first time and you say, oh, I really like the song, I want to keep listening to it, it's really great. And he says that he's going always a little bit further and to understand exactly why he liked the song. What was it about the melody or the lyrics or the silence or the instruments that made him resonate with the song? And I think it's the same sort of in the human experience. Like we navigate different spaces and we connect with specific things. And I think it's only when you understand that and when you grow as a person that you see these patterns and you feel more comfortable in those spaces.
I think it ultimately comes down to learning more and more about yourself. I do say knowing yourself, but you'll never know fully yourself, but you can keep exploring of what resonates with you.
Absolutely. I think that's the sort of the goal in life is to know or better know who you are.
With those deep words, Jacques, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.